instead of using an enum to represent all our top-level entities, let's go back to iTunes Entity and get rid of this type altogether. Also back in iTunes, the enum, let's remove the associated value that we added. So right here. And let's clean up any errors that occur or any errors that pop up because of that. So we'll get rid of it in the associated value right here and this block of code. And then finally in viewController.Swift, let's remove that. Okay, now in iTunes Entity.Swift, instead of the top level type that we had, so we had an enum here called iTunes Entity, instead let's define a protocol named iTunes Entity. All types that want to model an entity needs to provide an entity name value as a string. So in here we'll say var entity name of type string, and this is just gettable. Since we've done this work in the music entity type already, let's switch out this custom string convertible bit. We'll make that iTunes entity to conform over here, and instead of description, we'll say entity name. Okay, now let's define another protocol called Query Item Provider. So we'll add a new file, Swift file as always, and we'll call this Query Item Provider. This protocol, Query Item Provider, states that conforming types need to provide an instance of URL query item. So we'll say var query item of type URL query item, and again, this is just gettable. Instead of making conforming types do the work, however, so instead of having music entity conform to query item provider and actually provide a query item over here, let's take care of this with a few protocol-based features. So over here, we have this protocol iTunes Entity. Let's make it inherit from Query Item Provider, because remember, protocols can inherit from multiple protocols. The nice part now, since iTunes Entity already provides an interface to the information we need, we can provide an implementation for Query Item, the computed property, in an extension of the protocol iTunes Entity. So we'll say extension iTunes Entity, and in here we'll say Query Item. And since the protocol iTunes Entity defines a string called entity name, we can simply use that and say URL query item. The name for entity is always entity. That is the parameter name, the key. And the value here, we'll use the information encapsulated inside the iTunes Entity protocol, and we'll just say entity name. This way, by music entity simply conforming to iTunes Entity and providing an entity name, we automatically get a query item by default. This means that it reduces the amount of work we have to do in the iTunes type when trying to add a query item to the results array. The next problem I want to solve is to prevent ourselves from creating those mismatches where we would select music as the media type and podcast as the entity. So let's head over to iTunes Media, this enum, and just for the music case, we'll use an associated value in here to define the entity. So in here, we'll say music entity. The difference now is that the entity is modeled by the media type itself rather than the iTunes enum. Since we're not using that top-level iTunes entity enum anymore, we're directly associating the correct entity with the correct media choice. If I select iTunes Media and Music as a value, the only entity I can provide is the one defined by the music entity type. So we've taken care of that first problem. Now, we still have another issue though. When actually implementing all this to end up with our query items array, we don't want to keep switching on all of this inside the iTunes enum, right? Like we had to do a second ago. So instead, let's add another computed property, but this time to the iTunes Media type. So in here, we'll say extension iTunes Media. And then rather than doing the work in the iTunes type, we'll let the iTunes Media type surface the query item for the entity it carries as an associated value. Seems a little bit complicated, but hopefully it should be a bit more clear in code. So we'll say var entity query item of type URL query item, and we'll make this optional. This computed property is going to return an optional because the entity right here is an optional value as well. So if we specify nil here, then the entity query item this value will be nil as well. So again, inside here, we'll switch on self, and we'll ignore most of it for now. So we'll say default return nil. We're just exploring a potential solution here, so we're going to focus on the music member. So for the music case, we'll say case.music, if I learn how to type eventually, let entity. And then the logic here is really simple. Since we know the music entity type, this associated value, conforms to query item provider, we can just ask it for the query item. So we can say return entity.query item. So let's see how this improves the code in the iTunes type. So back in endpoint.swift, in the query items type, we still need to add the entity query item to the array and use it to construct a URL. Unlike before, though, all the work is more or less done. We just need to check if this media type now, if this media value returns an entity query item. So we can say if let entity query item equal, and we'll just say media dot, and then we'll get that computed property we just added. So if we pass in nil for the entity value, then this is an optional property, so it'll return nil as well, and we don't enter this if let statement. So if we do have an entity, we go into this if let statement, and all we need to do is say result.append entity query item. Much easier. So let's see how this looks at the call site. In viewcontroller.swift, now media.music is wrong. Instead, we want to say media.music entity is music artist. There's still a tiny bit of repetition, but it's much better than the previous version. In this case, you cannot provide an incorrect entity. And if you run the app now, although we've changed our interface completely, you should see that the result URL that we're looking for is the same, and we have the entity value that we're looking for. In the next video, let's finish up both the search and lookup endpoint.